At exactly 7:18 on Veterans Day evening, my son stood at a microphone in the Norfolk Civic Center and told 200 people that his mother had worn medals she had not earned. He did not stumble over the words. He did not look confused. He looked rehearsed. The room had been full of folded programs, small American flags, dinner plates, and men in old service caps sitting beside wives who had spent half their lives waiting for phone calls. A brass band had just finished playing America the Beautiful. Coffee steam rose from white cups on round tables. At the front of the room, behind my son's right shoulder, a large screen showed a photograph of my late husband in his Navy dress uniform. Then Brian looked down at the notes his wife had printed for him and said, "Before we honor my father properly, I need to correct a painful misunderstanding. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, has allowed people in this community to believe she served in combat. She did not. She served near combat. She worked around combat. But she has exaggerated her record for years, and tonight is about real sacrifice." Every sound in that room changed. Forks stopped moving, chairs creaked. Someone near the back whispered my name. A woman at the Veterans Council table turned halfway around to look at me, then quickly faced front again, as if meeting my eyes might make her part of the damage. My chair was empty at the family table because Brian and his wife, Kelsey, had moved my place card to the back of the room that morning. I was sitting beside the kitchen doors with the volunteers, wearing a navy blue dress, a string of pearls, and a coat I had bought at Belk 5 years earlier. My dress uniform was still hanging at home in a garment bag inside a cedar closet. I had not worn it because my son asked me not to. I was 64 years old. My knees ached in rainy weather. My hands had begun to shake slightly when I was tired. I needed reading glasses to see the tabs inside my own old service binder. But I had not forgotten who I was. In my purse, under a pack of tissues and a church bulletin folded in half, sat a sealed envelope from the Air Force Personnel Center. Beside my chair, leaning against the wall, was a green canvas flight logbook with a cracked spine and sand, still caught in one corner of the cover. My son had no idea what was inside, either one. To understand why he stood in public and tried to erase me, I have to go back to the summer, to the day we buried his father, and to the wooden chair at the head of my kitchen table that nobody knew what to do with after Tom was gone. My name is Eleanor Claire Bennett. Most people call me Nora. I was born in Eastern North Carolina, married at 22, became a mother at 26, and retired from the United States Air Force after 28 years. I began as a flight nurse and ended my career as a colonel coordinating aeromedical evacuation operations, which is a long way of saying I spent much of my adult life making sure wounded service members got from the wrong place to the right doctors before their families had to receive the worst kind of knock on the door. It was important work. It was also work that took pieces out of me I did not know how to put back. Tom Bennett, my husband, had served 6 years in the Navy before he became a high school history teacher. He loved his students, old maps, college basketball, and mowing the lawn in diagonal stripes even when nobody but him could tell the difference. Tom's service was real. He had earned his flag. He had earned every handshake people gave him at the hardware store and every free cup of coffee the diner insisted on pouring on Veterans Day. But Tom had never been overseas during wartime. That fact never bothered him while he was alive. At least I did not think it did. He used to say, "I did my part. Nora did hers." The country needed both. Still, inside our home, we did not speak much about what I had seen. At first, I told myself that was because I did not want to bring the war into the kitchen. Later, I admitted the quieter truth. I did not know how to explain to a child why his mother missed school, plays, little league games, birthdays, and one emergency appendectomy because somebody else's child was bleeding on a transport aircraft over a desert ocean. Brian grew up believing absence had a shape, and that shape looked like me. He was 38 when Tom died. He had his father's square jaw, his grandfather's stubborn chin, and my talent for saying very little when he was most angry. He worked in commercial insurance in Virginia Beach and had done well enough to buy a house with white shutters, a backyard fire pit, and a garage full of things he said he was going to organize someday. His wife, Kelsey, had married into our family 6 years earlier. She was polished in the way certain people learn to be polished when they discover charm can open doors faster than sincerity. She volunteered for committees, wrote beautiful thank you notes, remembered birthdays, and took photographs at every gathering before anyone had time to relax their face. She called me Miss Nora in front of people and your mother when speaking to Brian in the hallway. They had one daughter, Lila, 12 years old, all elbows and questions, with Tom's blue eyes and a habit of touching old objects as if they might tell her something. Lila was the reason I stayed quiet longer than I should have. Tom's funeral was held on a humid July morning at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the same church where he and I had been married 41 years earlier. The sanctuary smelled of lilies, candle wax, and the old wood of pews polished by generations of grieving hands. Brian sat in the front row with Kelsey and Lila. I sat beside them with a folded tissue in my lap and Tom's wedding ring on a chain under my black dress. The pastor spoke kindly. Former students told stories. A Navy honor guard performed with the precision that always makes the heart break in a disciplined way. When the flag was folded and presented, the young officer knelt in front of me and said the words every military spouse knows before they hear them. On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation. I held the flag against my chest and felt Tom's absence settle into my bones. Afterward, in the parish hall, people balanced paper plates of ham biscuits and potato salad while saying things they meant but could not possibly prove. He's in a better place. He was one of the good ones. You were blessed to have him as long as you did. All of that may have been true. None of it made me less widowed. Near the guest book, Kelsey had arranged a memorial table. There were photographs of Tom as a young sailor, Tom holding Brian as a baby, Tom teaching, Tom grilling in the backyard, Tom beside me on our 30th anniversary cruise. She had placed his Navy cap in the center and one of his old service ribbons in a small frame. My own service photograph had been left out. I noticed it immediately, then wished I had not. It seemed petty to care on the day we buried my husband, so I told myself the same thing I had told myself for years. Let it pass. This is not the moment. But pain has a way of remembering what dignity pretends not to notice. An hour later, I found Brian standing alone beside the memorial table, staring at a photograph of Tom at 24. He looked so young, I said. Brian nodded. He was younger than I realized. He loved that picture. I know. We stood quietly together. For a moment, I thought grief might soften whatever had hardened between us over the years. Then he said, Kelsey and I talked about starting a scholarship in Dad's name. That would have meant a lot to him. We want to do it through the Veterans Council, a history scholarship for military families, maybe an annual dinner. I think that's a lovely idea. He looked at me, and something guarded moved behind his eyes. We want it to be about Dad. Of course. I mean, just Dad. I folded my hands in front of me. I understand. I don't want people turning it into a thing about rank or medals or whatever. The words landed harder than he intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. I looked toward the memorial table. Tom's cap, Tom's ribbon, Tom's photographs. Not mine. Brian, I said quietly, I have never made your father's service smaller by having served myself. His mouth tightened. That's not what I said. No, but it is what you meant. He looked away first. When he spoke again, his voice had that careful flatness adult children use when they are trying not to sound cruel while saying something cruel. You were gone a lot, Mom. I was. Dad was there. Yes, he was. That matters. It does. He seemed almost annoyed that I was agreeing with him, then maybe let him have this. Behind us, Lila called for him from the dessert table. Brian walked away before I could answer. I stayed beside Tom's photographs, holding my purse strap with both hands, feeling 40 years of marriage, motherhood, and military service being sorted into boxes by people who had never carried any of them. That evening, after the last casserole had been placed in my refrigerator and the last neighbor had left, I sat alone at my kitchen table. Tom's wooden chair remained at the head, pulled back slightly, as if he had only stepped away to refill his coffee. I had bought that table in 1989 at an estate sale outside Goldsboro. One leg was shorter than the others, so Tom had folded a piece of cardboard under it and promised to fix it properly. He never did. For 35 years, that table had rocked slightly whenever anyone leaned on it. It had held Brian's homework, Tom's lesson plans, my deployment orders, Lila's finger paintings, unpaid bills, Thanksgiving pies, and one terrible letter from my mother that I still never threw away. It had witnessed more truth than most rooms in our house. I placed Tom's folded flag on the table and touched the triangle of blue field where the white stars pressed through the glass display case. I tried, I whispered, though I was not sure whether I was speaking to him, to God, or to myself. In the weeks after the funeral, Brian and Kelsey began talking about helping with my finances and decisions. Their help felt less like a hand under my elbow and more like a hand on the back of my neck. I declined, and the temperature in the family changed. At home, Lila visited one afternoon and found the cedar closet door open. My dress uniform hung inside a garment bag, the dark blue sleeve visible through clear plastic. She reached toward it with reverent curiosity. Grandma, is that yours? It is. Were you allowed to wear medals too? Allowed? Children hear more than adults think they do. Yes, I said. I earned them. She looked back toward the hallway, lowering her voice. Dad says Grandpa was the military one. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The old mattress dipped under me. Your grandpa served honorably, so did I. What did you do? I helped move wounded people from places where they could not get the care they needed to places where they could. Like an ambulance? Sometimes, but with airplanes. Her eyes widened. That sounds scary. Sometimes it was? Did you save anybody? The question went through me so cleanly that for a moment I smelled jet fuel instead of cedar. I heard a young man screaming for his mother inside a cargo aircraft. I felt blood warm through latex gloves. I saw my own reflection in a scratched porthole over the Atlantic. 39 years old, awake for too long, holding a pressure bandage in place with one hand and a rosary a Marine had given me with the other. Yes, I said finally. Some. Before Lila could ask anything else, Kelsey appeared in the doorway. There you are, she said brightly. We don't need to bother Grandma with old stories. They're not bothering me, I said. Kelsey's eyes moved to the uniform. Her smile did not change, but her face did. Lila, go wash your hands. We're leaving in 5 minutes. Lila obeyed reluctantly. When she was gone, Kelsey stepped inside the bedroom and lowered her voice. I'd rather you not confuse her. With what? With complicated military stuff. You mean my life? I mean, she's 12. She doesn't need graphic stories. I did not give her any. Kelsey glanced again at the uniform. Brian says you have a tendency to dramatize. That was the first time she said it plainly enough that I could not pretend not to understand. Dramatize what? I asked. Your service. The room seemed to narrow around us. I stood slowly, not because I needed height, but because my body remembered what to do when someone crossed a line. Kelsey, you are standing in my house beside a uniform you have no right to question, speaking about years you did not live. Her face flushed. I didn't mean disrespect. You meant control. Disrespect was the method. She picked up her purse from the bed. This is exactly what Brian means. No, I said. This is exactly what evidence sounds like before people are ready to hear it. She left without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived for the Veterans Day scholarship dinner. Heavy cream cardstock, embossed flag, gold lettering. Kelsey had done a beautiful job, which annoyed me more than poor work would have. The event would be held at the Norfolk Civic Center on November 11th, dinner at 6, program at 7, honoring the life and service of Thomas Richard Bennett, United States Navy veteran, teacher, husband, father, patriot. My name appeared only once. Family of Thomas Bennett. That same afternoon, Brian called. You got the invitation? I did. Good. I wanted to talk before the dinner. About what? Kelsey thinks it would be better if you don't wear your uniform. I looked across the kitchen at Tom's empty chair. Rain tapped lightly against the window. Does she? Mum. Are you asking or telling? I'm asking you not to make this hard. What would make it hard? He exhaled. People have questions. People always have questions. About your record. There it was again. No longer hinted, no longer dressed up as concern for Lila. My record is available to anyone legally authorized to see it. That sounds defensive. It sounds factual. Dad never talked like this. Your father also never questioned my service. Brian's voice sharpened, maybe because he was tired of arguing with you. I gripped the phone tighter. What has Kelsey told you? Don't turn this around on her. I am asking a direct question. She showed me things. What things? Posts, comments, people saying the units you mentioned don't match public records. One guy said there's no way you were where you claimed you were. One guy on the internet? He was in the Air Force. A great many people were in the Air Force, Brian. That does not make them custodians of my personnel file. See, you always do that. You hide behind paperwork. No, I said. Paperwork is what honest institutions use when memory and emotion become unreliable. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice sounded younger, and somehow that hurt more. I needed you home, Mom. I closed my eyes. I know. And you always had a reason. I did. Some mission. Some patient. Some country I couldn't find on a map. I know. Dad stayed. He did. So maybe let this one thing be his. I sat down slowly. For a moment, the fight left me. Not because he was right, but because underneath his accusation, I heard the little boy. He had been standing at the front window with a backpack on, waiting for a mother whose plane had been delayed by weather. Command? War or all three? I can honor your father without lying about myself, I said. Then come as my mom, not as Colonel Bennett. Those words stayed with me long after we hung up. Come as my mom. As if motherhood required me to arrive smaller than I was. As if the two identities had always been enemies, and he was finally demanding I choose. That night, I went to the cedar closet and unzipped the garment bag. My dress uniform smelled faintly of wool and the cedar blocks Tom had tucked on the shelf years earlier. The silver eagles were wrapped in tissue in a small box. My ribbons sat in order, checked twice before retirement, and never touched since. Flight nurse wings, air medal, bronze star, meritorious service medal, campaign ribbons, unit awards, years of distance and duty arranged in neat colored rectangles small enough to fit above a pocket. I did not put it on. Instead, I carried an old green flight logbook to the kitchen table and placed it beside Tom's chair. The cover was faded and cracked, its corners softened by years of movement. Inside were dates, tail numbers, patient counts, flight hours, fuel stops, notes written in my own hand and in the hands of people who had trusted the same aircraft not to fall out of the sky. The handwriting changed over the years. Mine tightened during stressful months. Some entries were nothing more than numbers, others carried small marks only I understood. One page, near the middle, had a coffee stain shaped like a crescent moon. May 4, 2003. I had not looked at that page in nearly 20 years. The mission had begun outside Balad, Iraq, though we did not know at first how bad it would be. A convoy had been hit on a road north of Baghdad. The initial casualty report said 6 urgent surgical, 9 priority, and more walking wounded than anyone could count properly in the dust. We were not the first aircraft scheduled, but the first one had mechanical trouble and the second was diverted. That left us. The aircraft was hot before we loaded the first patient. Not warm. Hot in the way metal gets when the sun has been beating on it all day and the air inside feels borrowed from a furnace. We had nurses, med techs, a respiratory therapist, security, and a crew trying to pretend the schedule still mattered. One of the wounded was a 19-year-old Army specialist named Daniel Ortiz. I remember his name because he kept apologizing for bleeding on my boots. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said, pale as paper, gripping my wrist with a hand that had more dirt than skin showing. "You can bleed on anything you want as long as you keep talking to me," I told him. He laughed. Once. Then passed out. We nearly lost him twice before Germany. That was the kind of story people think they want to hear until they hear it. Then their eyes change, and you find yourself comforting them for having asked. So I stopped telling those stories. Tom knew some of them, not many. Brian knew almost none. Silence protects other people, but it also gives dishonest people an empty room to decorate. In September, the first formal letter arrived from Brian's attorney. I read it twice at the kitchen table before I understood what I was seeing. The letter expressed concern about my recent erratic behavior, my unverified statements regarding military service, and my refusal to accept reasonable family assistance with financial and legal matters. It suggested a family meeting to discuss safeguards, including review of estate documents, medical assessment, and possible temporary financial oversight. Temporary financial oversight. That was a polite phrase for putting my son's hand on my checkbook. I called my attorney, Grace Hollowell, before I called Brian. Grace was 71, sharp-eyed, widowed twice, and had once told a judge, "Your Honor, my client may be old, but she is not public property." I had liked her ever since. She read the letter while I sat across from her office desk looking at framed photographs of her grandsons in baseball uniforms. "Well," she said finally, "this is ugly." "I thought so. Do you have any cognitive diagnosis?" "No." "Any doctor concerns?" "No." "Any missed bills, fraud alerts, unpaid taxes?" "No." "Good. Then this is not a protective letter. This is a pressure letter." I breathed for the first time in what felt like an hour. Grace tapped one fingernail against the page. "Why the emphasis on your service record?" "My daughter-in-law has been implying that I exaggerated it." "Did you?" "No. I had to ask." "I know. Can you prove it?" I almost smiled. "Yes." "Then prove it before they decide the lie for you." That sentence became the hinge on which everything turned. Grace was not a sentimental woman. She did not tell me to follow my heart. She did not say time heals all wounds. She pulled out a legal pad and started making a list: service records, award citations, retirement orders, medical records if they are going to suggest incapacity, banking records showing competence, witnesses who can verify your duties, communications from them suggesting motive. And for heaven's sake, stop handling this like a mother trying not to upset her son. Handle it like a grown woman who has property, history, and a name. I looked at her across the desk. She softened, but only slightly. Nora, the truth does not defend itself out of politeness. You have to put it where the lie is standing. That afternoon, I went home and opened the old blue service binder I had not touched since retiring. Tom had made fun of that binder for years because I labeled everything: awards, orders, evaluations, flight logs, medical credentials, retirement. He used to say if the house caught fire, I would save the binder before I saved the wedding album. He was wrong. I would have saved both. The first layer was easy. My DD Form 214 showed my years of service, final rank, deployments, decorations, and specialty. My retirement orders showed honorable service. My award citations listed more than enough to silence anyone acting in good faith. But good faith was not the problem. The problem was that Kelsey had found gaps in public-facing records and built a story inside them. Some operations had been recorded under unit names that changed later. Some dates were listed by deployment window, not mission day. Some medical evacuation details had been protected at the time for operational and patient privacy reasons. A person who wanted truth would ask. A person who wanted leverage would imply. Over the next month, I became a woman with a mission again. I requested a certified copy of my official military personnel file. I contacted the Air Force Personnel Center and the National Archives. I called old colleagues whose numbers still lived in a faded address book inside my desk drawer. Some numbers no longer worked. Some people had died. Some answered on the second ring as if no time had passed. Retired Chief Master Sergeant Ruth Alvarez was the first. "Well, I'll be damned," she said when she heard my voice. "Colonel Bennett, I thought you'd forgotten the rest of us existed." "I tried. You people keep being useful." She laughed, then listened. When I explained what was happening, the laughter disappeared. "Your own son?" "Yes." "And the wife?" "Yes." Ruth was quiet for a moment. I could hear wind chimes on her end of the call. "You still have the green logbook?" she asked. "I do." "Good. Don't let that thing out of your sight." "I have official records?" "Official records matter," she said. "But handwriting makes people remember there were hands." Ruth had served with me on 3 deployments and had once repaired an oxygen line with a clamp, a prayer, and language too colorful for a chapel. She knew where the records were thin and where memory could fill in the moral shape without violating anyone's privacy. A week later, an envelope arrived from her in Arizona. Inside was a photograph I had forgotten existed. There I was, in desert camouflage beside a C-17, hair pulled back, face drawn from lack of sleep, one hand raised to block the sun. Beside me stood Ruth, a young flight surgeon, and 3 medical technicians. On the back, in Ruth's square handwriting, she had written, "Ballade to Rammstein, May 2003. Bennett kept Ortiz breathing. Don't let anybody edit what they didn't live." I sat at the kitchen table, holding that photograph, until the room blurred. That evening, Lila called from her father's phone. "Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart. Dad doesn't know I'm calling." My heart tightened. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I just wanted to ask something." "Go ahead." "Did you really fly with hurt soldiers?" "Yes." "Mom said there are people who pretend to be heroes." I closed my eyes. "That is true," I said carefully. "Some people do pretend." "Did you?" "There are questions that hurt because they are cruel, and questions that hurt because the child asking them deserves an answer better than the world has given her." "No, Leela, I did not pretend." "Can you prove it?" "Yes." "Then why doesn't Dad believe you?" I looked toward Tom's chair. "Because sometimes pain chooses a story before facts arrive." She was quiet for a while. Then she whispered, "I don't want to choose wrong." "You do not have to choose me over your father." "But what if he's wrong?" "Then loving him will not require you to repeat it." The next day, Brian texted me, "Do not discuss military claims with Lila behind our backs." I stared at the phone long enough for the screen to dim. Then another message appeared. "If you keep this up, we will have to set stricter boundaries." That was the first time I realized he was using access to my granddaughter the way Kelsey used paperwork. Softly, politely, like a hand over a mouth. I forwarded both messages to Grace. Her reply came 10 minutes later. "Keep everything." So I did. By late October, the scholarship dinner had grown larger than anyone expected. The Veterans Council loved a good local story, and Tom had been well liked. Kelsey secured a sponsor from a regional bank, a catering company, a high school choir, and a retired news anchor to MC. She posted photographs online of herself sorting programs, standing beside banners, hugging veterans she had met only seconds earlier. Every post described Tom as the heart of a military family. Not once did she mention that his widow had retired as a colonel. On November 3rd, a large envelope arrived from the Air Force Personnel Center. I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes before opening it. It contained certified records, clean copies, seals, signatures, and the kind of bureaucratic language that has no poetry but tremendous weight. There was my retirement order. There were deployment dates. There was a certified award citation for the Bronze Star Medal. There was a certified award citation for the Air Medal, with mission references. There was also a letter I had not expected. It said that portions of the supporting documentation for a 2003 aeromedical evacuation mission had recently been reviewed for release to the service member because privacy restrictions had expired or been redacted. Enclosed were redacted mission notes, aircraft manifest references, and a copy of the recommendation narrative. I sat down before reading the narrative. The language was formal, but I could still hear the aircraft under it. Then Major Eleanor Bennett, United States Air Force, serving as senior flight nurse aboard an aeromedical evacuation mission, maintained continuous life-saving intervention for multiple urgent surgical patients during extended transport under extreme operational conditions. Her decisive triage actions, personal courage, and refusal to abandon critical care procedures directly contributed to the survival of 7 wounded service members. 7. I remembered each face as a condition, not a number. Airway, bleeding, burns, shock, pain, panic, silence. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. For the first time since the funeral, I wished Tom were there not to defend me, but to sit with me in the knowledge of what defending myself would cost. 2 days before the dinner, Kelsey confirmed my seat at table 12 and asked whether I planned to bring documents. I told her only that I would attend quietly. That was true. Quiet does not mean empty-handed. That afternoon, Ruth called again. Are you going Saturday? Yes. Alone? Yes. No, you're not. I don't need an escort. I didn't offer one. Then what are you offering? A witness. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Ruth. Daniel Ortiz lives in Newport News. The name struck me so suddenly I had to grip the counter. What? He found me years ago through a veterans network. Asked if I knew how to reach you. You weren't answering old email by then. I could barely speak. He's alive? Very alive. Married. 2 kids. Deputy sheriff now, or something close to it. He asked me once to tell you thank you. I told him he should do it himself if the chance ever came. Ruth, no. Yes. This is not his burden. No, she said. It's his choice. I sat down slowly. Ruth's voice softened in a way I had rarely heard. Nora, you spent years thinking humility meant disappearing? It doesn't. Sometimes it means letting the people you help stand up straight in public. I did not answer for a long time. Finally, I asked, does he know what happened? He knows enough. And he wants to come? He already bought a suit. The dinner was held on a cold, wet Saturday at the Norfolk Civic Center. I wore the navy blue dress, not the uniform, and carried the blue binder and green flight logbook through a lobby that smelled of raincoats, coffee, and floor polish. Table 12 sat near the kitchen doors. At table 1, Brian sat stiffly beside Kelsey and Lila. When Lila saw me, she started to rise. Kelsey touched her wrist, and my granddaughter sat back down. At 6'5", she was 70 but carried herself like gravity, still asked permission. She wore a dark pantsuit with a small Air Force pin on the lapel. Beside her walked a tall man in his early... He looked around the room with the alertness of someone trained to know where exits were. I knew him before Ruth said his name. Daniel Ortiz. Not 19 anymore. Not pale, bleeding, apologizing for my boots. A grown man, alive in a room where my son had planned to tell people I had imagined him. My hands started shaking. Ruth reached table 12 and placed her hand on my shoulder. Colonel. I looked up. Chief. Daniel stood there with tears already in his eyes. Ma'am, he said softly. I tried to stand. My knee caught against the table leg. He reached out, not to steady me like an old woman, but to help me like a person he respected. I've wanted to say thank you for 23 years, he said. For a moment, the entire room disappeared. There was only a young soldier's hand on my wrist in the belly of a hot aircraft, and this grown man standing in a banquet hall with his life behind him and in front of him at the same time. You kept talking, I said. He smiled through tears. You told me I could bleed on anything I wanted. Ruth laughed under her breath. Sounds like you. Before I could answer, Kelsey appeared beside us. Miss Nora, she said, her smile fixed and bright. I didn't realize you had guests. They are not my guests, I said. They are veterans. Kelsey looked at Ruth's pin, then at Daniel. I'm sorry, but seating was assigned in advance. Ruth turned slowly toward her, then unassigned something. Kelsey blinked. Excuse me? Ruth's voice remained perfectly calm. Chief Master Sergeant Ruth Alvarez, United States Air Force, retired. This is Daniel Ortiz, United States Army, retired. We contacted the Veterans Council this afternoon. 2 seats were made available. That was Ruth. She had probably arranged it with 3 phone calls and made someone apologize for not thinking of it first. Kelsey looked toward Brian. He stood from table 1 and walked toward us, his face tight. What is this, Yas? I met his eyes. Dinner, apparently. Mom, Daniel extended a hand. Brian Bennett? Daniel Ortiz. Your mother served as senior flight nurse on the mission that evacuated me in 2003. Brian looked at his hand, but did not take it. I don't know anything about that, he said. Daniel lowered his hand slowly. That is becoming obvious. Kelsey stepped between them. The program is about to begin. We can discuss introductions later. Ruth looked at me. You all right? No, I said, but I'm upright. That'll do for now. At 7 o'clock, the lights dimmed slightly. The MC took the stage. He spoke warmly about Tom's teaching career, his Navy service, and his love for family. A slideshow began. Tom as a sailor. Tom as a father. Tom at school. Tom holding Lila as a baby. Tom beside me in a vacation photograph cropped so tightly that my shoulder nearly disappeared. I watched without reacting. There are times when the body knows that stillness is the only thing standing between dignity and spectacle. After the slideshow, the Veterans Council president presented a plaque. Then Brian walked to the microphone. He carried folded notes. Kelsey stood near the edge of the stage, watching him with the intensity of someone who had written more than she wanted known. Brian began with stories about Tom. Some were beautiful. He spoke about his father teaching him to change a tire, staying up late to help with history projects, sitting in the bleachers during every baseball game even when it rained. I listened and let the truth of those memories be true. Tom had been a good father. Brian's love for him was not a lie. Then Brian's voice changed. Those of us who grew up in military families understand that service is not a costume, he said. Ruth's hand moved slightly on the table. Brian continued. It is not something we claim because it makes us feel important. My father never exaggerated. He never made himself the center of attention. He lived quietly, served quietly, and came home to serve his family. Lila stared at her plate. Recently, Brian said, our family has had to confront painful questions about stories that have been repeated for years. Stories involving medals, combat missions, and sacrifice. I wish this did not have to be said here, but silence has allowed confusion to grow. The room shifted. People sensed trouble before they understood it. Then came the sentence. Before we honor my father properly, I need to correct a painful misunderstanding. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, has allowed people in this community to believe she served in combat. She did not. She served near combat. She worked around combat. But she has exaggerated her record for years, and tonight is about real sacrifice. A woman gasped near the front. Someone whispered, "Oh Lord." I did not move. Brian looked toward me. For 1 second, I saw regret flash across his face. Then he pressed forward. Because pride is a poor driver, but a stubborn one. I say this not to shame her, he said, which is what people say when shame is exactly the tool in their hand. I say it because my father's memory deserves honesty. My chair at table 12 felt very far from him. The MC looked uncertain. The Veterans Council president had gone pale. Kelsey stood frozen near the stage, watching the room instead of me. Then Mr. Hanley, the Korean War veteran beside me, leaned close and whispered, "Ma'am, is any of that true?" I turned to him. "No," I said. He nodded once. Thought not. I stood. The room quieted in a different way. Not silent, waiting. Ruth stood beside me. Daniel stood too. Kelsey hurried to the microphone before I reached the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, laughing nervously, "emotions are high tonight. We're going to take a brief pause for dessert service." Nobody moved. I walked slowly down the aisle carrying the blue binder and the green logbook. My shoes made soft sounds against the carpet. I did not hurry. I had spent enough years rushing toward alarms. This truth could walk. At the front of the room, I stopped below the stage and looked up at my son. Brian, I said, not loudly, but the microphone caught enough of it. Did you verify what you just told these people? His face reddened. Mom, don't. That is not an answer. Kelsey leaned toward him. Brian, step back. He did not. I turned to the Veterans Council president. May I respond? The poor man looked as if he would rather be anywhere else in Virginia. Mrs. Bennett, perhaps this is a family matter. No, Ruth said from behind me. Her voice carried like it had crossed flight lines for 40 years. He made it a public accusation. The response belongs in the same room. Daniel added quietly, I am part of the response. A murmur moved through the tables. The council president nodded. You may respond briefly. Briefly. After 40 years, they still wanted the woman to be brief. I stepped onto the stage. Brian moved back as if I had brought fire with me. Kelsey tried to take the microphone, but I held out my hand. No, I said. Not this time. The words came out calm enough to surprise even me. I placed the blue binder on the podium. Then I set the green flight logbook beside it. My name is Eleanor Claire Bennett, I said. I am Tom Bennett's widow. I am Brian Bennett's mother. I am Lila Bennett's grandmother. I am also a retired colonel of the United States Air Force. The room was still. I did not intend to speak tonight. My husband deserved to be remembered with love, and I came prepared to give him that. But my son has made a serious accusation in front of this community, and I will answer it with records, not volume. Brian looked down. I opened the binder. This is a certified copy of my service record. It includes 28 years of honorable service, my final rank, my specialty, my deployments, and my decorations. I turned one document toward the council president, who stepped closer with reading glasses, shaking slightly in his hand. This is my retirement order. This is my DD form 214. This is the citation for my Air Medal. This is the citation for my Bronze Star Medal. Kelsey whispered, this isn't appropriate. Ruth replied from the front row, neither was defamation. A few people turned toward her. Nobody argued. I touched the green logbook. This is not an official decoration. It is a flight logbook kept during deployments. It contains mission dates, aircraft references, patient counts, and notes from medical evacuation flights. It is not a trophy. It is a record of work. My fingers rested on the cracked cover. On May 4th, 2003, I served as senior flight nurse aboard an aeromedical evacuation mission carrying wounded service members from Iraq to Germany. The aircraft was overloaded, hot, and delayed. Multiple patients were unstable. One of them was a 19-year-old soldier named Daniel Ortiz. Daniel stood in the aisle. Every eye moved to him. He walked forward without waiting to be invited. When he reached the stage, he did not climb up. He stood below it, as if refusing to make this performance. His voice was steady, but his hands were clasped tightly in front of him. My name is Daniel Ortiz, he said. I was a specialist in the United States Army. On May 4th, 2003, my convoy was hit north of Baghdad. I was evacuated on the mission Colonel Bennett just described. I know her voice because she is the one who kept telling me to stay awake. I know her hands because she held pressure on me when I was bleeding out. I know her service because I am alive to say it. The room did not breathe. Daniel looked at Brian. Your mother did not steal a story, he said. I have lived 23 extra years inside the truth of it. Lila began to cry. Brian's mouth opened, but no words came. Then Ruth stood. I served with Colonel Bennett, she said. I was on that mission. I was on others. Anybody who told you she worked around combat either does not understand aeromedical evacuation or chose not to. Wounded people do not arrive cleaned up for photographs. They arrive broken, frightened, bleeding, burned, and begging not to die. Your mother did not watch from a safe office. She worked where the wounded were. She turned to the room, and while we are correcting the record, let us correct another thing. Colonel Bennett did not make herself small in her marriage. Tom Bennett respected her service. I heard him say it. A sound came from Brian then. Not quite a word. I reached into the binder and removed one more document. This is a letter Tom wrote for my retirement ceremony, I said. I had found it tucked behind a program, folded twice. He had read part of it publicly in 2011, but not all. I had forgotten the last paragraph until that week. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it. Tom wrote, there were years when I had to explain to our son why his mother was gone. I did not always do that well. It is easier for a child to understand absence as abandonment than duty, but I want it recorded that Eleanor never left us because she loved us less. She left because the country asked her to carry other people home, and she came back carrying more than most of us ever saw. I stopped because my throat closed. No one in the room moved. I looked at Brian. Your father wrote that. He knew. Brian's face had changed completely. The certainty had drained out of it, leaving something naked and young and ashamed. Kelsey stepped toward the podium. This is private family material. I turned to her. You made my service public when you helped my son question it. I did not. You sent messages to members of the Veterans Council suggesting my records were inconsistent. You told my granddaughter I dramatized my service. You asked my son to request financial oversight because I refused to sign documents you brought to my kitchen table. Her face went white. Brian looked at her. What? I removed printed screenshots from the binder. Grace had told me to carry only what I was willing to use. I had prayed not to use them. Prayers are not always answered the way we want. These were provided to my attorney by a council member who became concerned about the nature of the claims being made. I will not read all of them, but I will read one. I looked at Kelsey. You wrote, if Nora is allowed to wear that uniform, donors will shift attention to her. Tom's story has to stay clean and simple. Brian is ready to challenge her if needed. The room erupted in whispers. Brian stared at Kelsey as if seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. She shook her head. That is out of context. What context makes it honorable? Ruth asked. Kelsey had no answer. I turned back to the microphone. I did not come here to compete with my dead husband. I loved him. He loved me imperfectly, as I loved him imperfectly. He served honorably, so did I. His memory does not require my erasure. My motherhood does not require my silence. And my age does not make my records negotiable. For the first time all night, applause began from the back of the room. Not loud at first. One pair of hands. Mr. Hanley, standing slowly beside table 12. Then another. Then the volunteers. Then a woman near the front. Then veterans, in caps, who understood, maybe better than anyone, that records matter because memory can be wounded by politics, pride, and family. I did not smile. Applause can be kind, but it does not undo the moment that made it necessary. The council president returned to the microphone, visibly shaken. Colonel Bennett, he said, using my rank for the first time that evening. On behalf of the council, I apologize. We should have verified concerns before allowing any statement to be made. Thank you, I said. He turned toward the audience. This organization recognizes Colonel Eleanor Bennett's honorable service and thanks her for it. It was not grand. It was not enough. But it was a correction, and correction is where repair begins if people are brave enough to continue it after the room empties. After the council president corrected the record, the evening limped toward its end. People left in small, embarrassed clusters. Ruth squeezed my shoulder. Daniel shook my hand with both of his, then stepped back so Lila could reach me. Lila came toward me slowly. She looked 12 and older than 12 at the same time. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. Dad was wrong. Yes. Mom, too. Yes. Are you mad at me because I asked if you could prove it? That nearly broke me. I knelt carefully so my eyes were level with hers. My knees protested, but some things are worth the pain. No. You asked for truth. That is never wrong when you are willing to receive it. She started crying again. I didn't know who to believe. I know. I wanted Grandpa to be special. He was. But you are too. I touched her cheek. There was always room for both. She hugged me around the neck with the force of a child who had been holding herself together too long. Across the room, Brian watched us. He did not come over until Lila stepped away to get her coat. When he reached me, he looked worse than he had at Tom's funeral. Mom, he said. I waited. He looked at the binder in my arms, then at the logbook. I don't know what to say. That is probably the first honest thing you have said tonight. He flinched. I let him. Kelsey told me there were questions. I'm sure she did. She showed me posts, messages, gaps. You thought the worst explanation was easier than asking your mother to show you the truth. He swallowed. Yes. I watched his face. I knew that face. It was the face of a boy caught between shame and pride. But he was not a boy anymore, and I was done treating adult harm like childhood confusion. Brian, you did not just misunderstand. You stood in front of a room and called me a fraud. His eyes filled. I know. You questioned my mind. I know. You threatened my access to Lila. He looked down, and you tried to turn your father's memory into a weapon against me. His mouth tightened, as if he might defend himself. Then he seemed to think better of it. I was angry, he said. Yes, I've been angry for a long time. I know. I hated that you left. I know that too. I told myself Dad was the one who stayed because he loved me more. Those words landed heavily between us. Not because they surprised me, but because hearing the wound name did not make the bleeding stop. Your father loved you very much, I said. So did I. I know that now. No, I said gently. You know more than you knew this morning. That is not the same thing. He looked at me then, and for the first time in years, he did not seem angry. He seemed lost. What do I do? He asked. I thought about Tom's chair, the power of attorney papers, Kelsey in the bedroom doorway, Lila asking if I had pretended, the entire room freezing at Brian's accusation. I thought about every year I had swallowed my own defense because I believed peace was something mothers owed their children at any cost. You start by telling the truth to every person you lied to, I said. He nodded slowly. And after that? After that, you learn that apology is not a key. It does not unlock the same door you closed. Tears ran down his face. Are you saying you won't forgive me? No. I am saying forgiveness and access are not the same thing. He absorbed that like a man taking a blow he knew he had earned. What about Lila? You will not use her as a boundary marker against me again. I won't. If she has questions about my life, I will answer them in a way appropriate for her age. You may be present. You may not silence me. He nodded. And my finances, my house, my records, and my medical decisions are mine unless a court says otherwise. Not yours, not Kelsey's. His face reddened with shame. I never should have sent that letter. No, I said. You should not have. For a moment, I saw a small boy again, standing at a school door, trying not to cry because his mother's flight had been delayed. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to undo what my service had cost him. But wanting to comfort someone does not require letting them escape consequence. I am sorry, he said. Not for tonight being awkward. Not for being caught. I am sorry I called you a liar. I am sorry I let my anger make your whole life look suspicious. I am sorry I made Lila doubt you. And I am sorry I used Dad against you. It was the first apology specific enough to matter. Thank you, I said. He seemed to hope for more. I did not give it. Across the room, Kelsey picked up her coat and walked toward the exit without speaking to me. Lila watched her go, confused and frightened. Brian turned to follow, then stopped. I need to take my daughter home, he said. Yes, I said. You do? He hesitated. Can I call you tomorrow? You can leave a message? His face fell slightly. That is where we begin, I said. The drive home felt longer than the drive there. Rain had stopped, but the roads shone black under the streetlights. The blue binder sat on the passenger seat. The green logbook lay on top of it, wrapped again in cloth. My body trembled from the aftershock of restraint. People think strength feels like power. Sometimes it feels like making it to your own driveway before you fall apart. Inside the house, the kitchen was dark except for the small stove light Tom had always left on. His wooden chair remained at the head of the table, pulled back slightly. I placed the binder and logbook in front of it, then sat in my own chair and cried so hard the sound startled me. I cried for Tom, for Brian, for Lila, for Daniel Ortiz at 19, for the 7 patients listed in formal language as survival outcomes, for the woman I had been who thought coming home alive meant the family would understand the price without being told. Near midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from Ruth. You still up, right? I typed back, mostly. Her answer came quickly. Good. Tomorrow we eat pancakes. That made me laugh through tears, which is how I knew the night had not destroyed me. The aftermath was not clean. The council apologized in writing. The bank held the scholarship funds until governance was reviewed. Brian left messages that began defensive and slowly became specific. He told the council he had not verified his accusation, corrected the donors in writing, and admitted he had used Lila as leverage. I did not answer the first message. I answered the one that named the harm. That Sunday, Brian brought Lila to my house. Kelsey did not come. I had made soup, because soup gives people a reason to sit without forcing celebration. The house smelled of chicken broth, thyme, and biscuits warming in the oven. Lila went straight to the kitchen table and stopped at Tom's chair. Can I sit there? She asked. I looked at Brian. He looked at me. Then I said yes. She sat carefully, as if the chair were sacred. In a way, it was. Not because Tom had been perfect, but because love and imperfection had worn the wood smooth together. After lunch, we went to the cedar closet. I unzipped the garment bag and took out the dress uniform. Lila touched the sleeve with one finger. It's heavier than I thought, she said. It felt heavier some days than others. Ryan stood behind her, hands in his pockets. I showed them the silver eagles, the ribbons, the wings. I explained what some meant and left others alone. I told Lila that medals are not proof a person is better than someone else. They are records that something happened and that someone witnessed it. Then I brought out the green logbook. We sat at the kitchen table. the three of us, with Tom's flag on the sideboard and afternoon light coming through the window. I opened to a page from a routine training flight first, then one from Germany. Then, after asking whether she was ready, I opened to the 4th of May, 2003. I did not describe blood. I did not describe fear in detail. I told her there had been wounded soldiers who needed to get to a hospital, that the aircraft was hot, that people were tired, and that everyone did the job they were trained to do. Was Mr. Ortiz one of them? She asked. Yes. And he lived. He did. Because of you? Because of many people, I said. I was one of them. She considered that. But if you weren't there, it might have been different. Yes. She nodded, accepting the weight without needing to decorate it. Brian had not spoken for several minutes. Finally, he touched the edge of the page. This is your handwriting. Yes. He traced the date with his eyes. I was 15. You were. I remember that month. Dad said you were delayed. I was. He didn't say why. I asked him not to give details. Brian looked up. Why? Because I thought protecting you from the ugly parts would protect you from the war. He closed the logbook, gently. It didn't, he said. No, I said. It only left you alone with the absence. That was one of the hardest truths I had to accept. My silence had been honorable in intention and damaging in practice. Kelsey had exploited that damage, but she had not invented the space. Some of it had been there for years, waiting for a careless person to move in and hang curtains. Before Brian left, he stood by the front door and said, I'm going to keep correcting it. What? The lie. Every place I put it. That will take time. I know. Some people will think you're only doing it because you got caught. He nodded. They may be right at first. That answer was more honest than a perfect one would have been. Over the next months, repair moved in inches. Brian wrote letters to every person he had misled. Kelsey sent a vague apology first, then a better one after Grace, reminded her attorney that truth is not harassment. I accepted the correction, not the closeness. Civil was possible. Trust would take longer. By the next Veterans Day, the scholarship had been renamed. The Thomas and Eleanor Bennett Service and History Scholarship. I resisted at first. It felt like overcorrection. Brian said, maybe, but Dad's name was used to erase yours. I want the correction to be visible. Grace said accepting visible correction was not vanity. Ruth said if I turned it down, she would personally haunt my porch with bagpipes. Daniel Ortiz said his family wanted to contribute the first donation. So I agreed. The second dinner was smaller. That was fine. Some people came the first year for gossip, dressed as patriotism. They did not return when the room required humility. The food was better. Or maybe I was less numb. The choir sang again. Mr. Hanley complained that the coffee was still weak. Ruth sat beside me at the family table, where my place card read Colonel Eleanor Bennett, USAF, retired. Brian gave the opening remarks. He looked nervous. That was good. A man should be nervous when standing where he once used a microphone badly. He spoke first about Tom. Fishing trips, teaching, Navy stories, lawn stripes. Then he took a breath and looked at me. Last year, in this room, I failed my mother publicly, he said. I questioned service I had not taken the time to understand. I let old hurt make me careless with truth. Tonight, I want to say clearly that Colonel Eleanor Bennett served this country honorably and courageously. She was not less of a mother because she served. She was a mother carrying more duty than I knew how to understand. He paused. I am still learning the cost of the words I said. I am grateful she allowed me the chance to learn in public what I damaged in public. He looked down then, not for drama, but because the words had weight. No one applauded immediately. They let it sit. Then the applause came, steady and respectful. I did not cry. Lila did enough for both of us. After dinner, the first scholarship was awarded to a 17-year-old girl whose mother was deployed with the Navy and whose father had died of cancer the year before. She wanted to study history because, as she wrote in her essay, families can survive hard service better when people tell the truth about what it costs. When she shook my hand, she said, my mom missed my graduation practice last month. I was mad. Your story helped me talk to her instead of just staying mad. That alone would have been worth the whole uncomfortable evening. At the end of the night, Lila pulled me toward the display table. She had helped arrange it. There were 2 photographs of Tom, his Navy cap, a copy of one of his lesson plans, my flight nurse wings, Ruth's photograph from Balad, and the picture of little Brian saluting crookedly beside me. In the center sat the green logbook, closed, not open for strangers to inspect, but present enough to say the record existed. Beside it was Tom's handwritten line from my retirement letter. She left because the country asked her to carry other people home, and she came back carrying more than most of us ever saw. I stood there for a long time. Brian came up beside me. Is it too much? No, I said. It is enough. Kelsey approached a few minutes later. She and Brian were still separated, though speaking more kindly. She did not try to hug me. She did not call me Miss Nora in that sweet public voice. She simply said, Colonel Bennett, the display looks right. I looked at her. Thank you. That was all. It was enough for that day. Later, when the room had nearly emptied, I carried the green logbook to the car myself. Brian offered to take it. I told him no, then handed him the blue binder instead. He understood the difference. The logbook held memories I was still choosing how to share. The binder held records the family had finally learned to respect. Back at my house, we gathered around the kitchen table for pie. Ruth came, Daniel and his wife came, Brian brought Lila, even Mr. Hanley came because Lila had adopted him as an honorary grumbler, and he claimed my pecan pie was almost regulation. Tom's chair at the head of the table did not remain empty that night. Lila sat there again, laughing as Ruth told a story about a cargo aircraft, a broken coffee maker, and a colonel who threatened to write an incident report against a machine. Brian sat to my right. Daniel sat across from me. The table rocked every time someone leaned on it because the cardboard was still under the leg. No one fixed it. After everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen, washing coffee cups by hand, though the dishwasher worked perfectly. Outside, the porch light glowed over the steps where Tom used to shake rain from his jacket. Inside, the framed photograph of him sat on the sideboard beside the flag. My uniform hung again in the cedar closet. The binder was back on the shelf. The green logbook rested on the kitchen table, not hidden, not displayed, simply present. I thought about the first dinner, the moved chair, the accusation, the horrible silence after my son's words. I thought about every year I had believed being a good mother meant absorbing pain quietly so my child would not have to feel the consequences of causing it. I had been wrong. Love without truth does not protect the family. It trains the family to fear truth. The photograph did not change who I had been. The records did not make my service more real than it already was. Daniel Ortiz, standing in that room, did not create my dignity. He only made it harder for others to deny what had always existed. Near midnight, I turned off the kitchen light. Then I noticed Tom's wooden chair had drifted slightly away from the table, the way it always did when someone stood up in a hurry. I pushed it back in, then changed my mind and pulled it out again. Just a little. Some chairs should not stay empty forever. Some should remain open for the truth when it finally comes home. And if I learned anything from all those years in uniform, from marriage, from motherhood, from grief, and from one terrible night under bright banquet lights, it is this. Respect should never require witnesses. But once the truth has witnesses, no one gets to make you disappear in your own story again.